I'm going to ask a pretty controversial question. I heard you guys talking about two parents that are smart and heard about something about the offspring of those parents facing return to the mean in intelligence. Now, I know what that term means as far as economics, where if one company is having excess profits, that will attract competitors, which will drive the profits down to basically the marginal cost. That makes sense to me. Or the same thing with arbitrage in finance. But as far as genetics and evolution, I thought that if there was a trait that was advantageous, parents would be more likely to pass it off to their offspring, and that's how evolution works. And I've heard certain pundits say that, and this is the controversial part, that different races have different average IQs. So even if we bring in, say there's a really smart guy from India, and he comes into the West, if he has kids, his kids won't necessarily be super smart. The intelligence of his children would return to the average of that population from that country or that race or whatever. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were basically about that and how that works, return to the mean with intelligence, and how it works with evolution.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and recent evidence has come to light to make this much more PC than we might have thought. I can remember I read an article, Brian, just a couple of years ago. It was Jeffrey Miller, and Miller was, people that have listened to me know that I have great admiration for Jeffrey Miller's intelligence. I don't necessarily have great admiration for his personality. He is who he is. He's his own man, and he makes his own mistakes, and that's fine by me. But I have legitimate admiration for a searing intellect that he carries. And so when he wrote a piece, I don't know, 3-4 years ago, maybe somebody could find it, where he was basically saying that the Chinese government, by virtue of their draconian control over the population, was busy looking for these genetic indicators of high IQ. And he had said that they had found such an indicator. In other words, they'd found a specific gene that was associated with super high IQs. And and so he said, listen, it's game over for the West, that the West will no longer be dominant in world history, because the Chinese government is going to go about its business of essentially selectively breeding individuals that carry this gene. And essentially what they're going to do is that in a single generation, they can massively increase the average IQ. And in 2 or 3 generations, they can spectacularly increase the average IQ as a result of this. And so he's basically saying, listen, you're going to have an entire population of 1 billion people with 3 generations that are going to be walking around with what would be a 99th percentile IQ relative to the West, at which point you could forget it. They'll outcompete you in every single aspect of commercial and military problems that there is. And I read that and I thought, oh my God, I can't believe what I'm looking at. I'm not going to have to worry about it because I won't be here. But I could literally see the possibility that such a thing could be true, that there could be people in the leadership of China that would be thinking along those lines, and there would be nothing to stop them in a society like that from actually executing on it. Whereas, of course, nobody in the West would ever even think of doing such a thing, and there won't be such a thing that will ever take place. And so I thought, oh my God, that's literally possible. And it's not only at the end of that article, it was not only possible. I mean, as fantastical as it is as a concept, I mean, there's a tremendous logic to it. And I thought, wow, I wonder, it's not like it happens overnight. It just gently starts happening. The mean IQ of China goes from, 107 to 108 to 109 to 115 to 121 to 126 to 135. And then it's just like unbelievable. The productivity of IQ juxtaposed to high technology, makes a very smart person, super potentially valuable, as witness the salaries in Silicon Valley. Okay, so now I looked at that and I kind of put it away in the corner of my mind and shrugged my shoulders and said, well, there's nothing I can do about it, and I don't really care that much, but it's weird. And then I read Plowman. And Plowman explained something that Jeffrey Miller didn't know when he was writing that article, even very recently, which is that even though there may be a marker gene that is associated with these very high IQs, that gene isn't responsible for it. Therefore, if you select on it, it isn't going to do any good. And so the truth is that there isn't one gene or 5 genes or 13 genes or 27 genes. And if there's 5 genes, you're sunk anyway, okay? But it's not. IQ differences, differences in physical appearance, differences in propensity to gain weight, athleticism, beauty, anything that you look at, it turns out thousands of genes are involved. So every gene has a tiny little influence. Essentially, the genes are like little tiny grains of sand, and together they collectively build a sculpture. But no one gene is responsible, and no 50 genes are responsible. So this is a very heartening and pleasant discovery that is not controversial and has now settled the issue. So it was no surprise then. Well, I mean, we wouldn't have known the parameters of this issue until we had done the scientific research. But behind this understanding that Plowman says was way off the radar 20 years ago. Like nobody had any idea that what I'm saying is true. Well, a few people had an inkling that it might be true, but nobody really thought that this was true. Everybody thought that, the differences in people's weights might be due to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 genes. The differences in IQ might be as a result of 10 genes. That made sense. The differences in whether people are depressed or not depressed might be a certain amount of genes. They were looking like crazy for the gene or genes that might be responsible for schizophrenia. Okay, so they knew it wasn't one gene because it didn't fall along Mendelian genetic probabilities. But it turns out that, they were thinking, I don't know, maybe 5, maybe 10, maybe it's on chromosome 17, like whatever, all kinds of ideas. Everybody was wrong. It turns out it's thousands and thousands of genes. And so as a result, it turns out to be the case that offspring's IQs are expected to be 13 points different than the parents' IQs. And if two regular unrelated people in the population drawn randomly from a crowd in Times Square on New Year's, the average difference between those two people is only 17 points. So of course, very intelligent parents are likely to have intelligent children, but they're also likely to have children that are average. And so it's not going to be the case that the Chinese or anybody else is going to be able to selectively breed a pair of 150 IQ parents and wind up with a 150 IQ child. If they breed a couple of parents that have 150 IQ, parents have 150 IQs, the child is very likely to have 137 IQ. Okay, and then if they breed that child, the second generation, to 150 IQ superstar, then the mean of those two people would be 144. So therefore, the next child out is likely to be 131. Okay, so they aren't able to maintain it as we see the high IQ parents who started out at 150. Their child will be 137. Their grandchild will be 131. It's not going to fly. Okay, so this is the regression to the mean phenomenon, and that's why there's a young man out there who loves basketball, and his name is Michael Jordan. He's Michael Jordan's son, and he's a pretty big guy. I think he's 6'2", 6'3", played college basketball at some tiny little podunk school. He wasn't very good. He got heckled because he wasn't anything like his dad, but he loved the game and he played anyway. So he's basically a small-time, little, small college hack basketball player. Good for him. I'm glad and I'm proud of the guy that he went out there and played because he loved the game, even though he can't even sniff the big time even in college ball. So that's regression to the mean, and so that's how it actually works. When it comes to races, there are racial differences in personality. There's racial differences in physical abilities of various kinds on average. Okay, within every what you would call a race, there's a huge diversity of individuals in there. But within each of those, that you could plot a bell curve, and those bell curves are going to be different on every possible dimension, including the structure of their teeth. Okay, so I have a good friend of mine, that went into a dentist. Finally got there, and the dentist looked at her teeth and said, "Are you part Asian?" And she said, "No, not to my knowledge." He goes, "Oh, are you part Indian?" She said, "Yeah, in fact, I am." So it turns out there's some characteristic that is discernible in tooth structure that 8 generations ago, somebody mated with a Native American 100 years ago, 150 years ago. So, but that characteristic is typically seen in Asia. So anyway, in answer to your question, are there differences? Sure. But that's not. I'm not particularly interested in those differences for any particular reason. Groups don't get jobs. Groups don't achieve. Individuals do. So what we're really interested in here is the impact of genes on individuals and our personal individual offspring, and what this means, and how evolution would work here. And what we find is that two very smart people are likely to have an above average child. They may have a really smart one. They may have an average one. So I know of 2 people whose IQs I can definitely tell you are north of 140. I know both of them, and their child is literally in the middle of the bell curve. Okay, so this is regression to the mean, and whatever we said that you heard last time is true. And anybody that thinks like begets like in very tight tolerances, and therefore there's a stratification of genes and capability that was essentially predicted by the bell curve in 1986. This turns out to be not true, that the genes and their attendant strengths and weaknesses flow reasonably freely up and down the gene pool, and that's actually how inheritance seems to work in our species.
Is there a book that you would recommend if I want to learn a little bit more about that, and also a book you would recommend if I want to learn a little bit more about personality psychology, the Big Five?
Yeah, it's actually the 2 books that I would recommend if you want to understand behavior genetics is Plomin, Blueprint. It's the standard of the field at the moment, and the book on the Big Five, an excellent book on the Big Five, is Miller's book Spent. That's a superb document. It's a little crazy
thank you very
at the
much.
end, but that's because Miller's crazy.
Just one follow-up question on this. Is it possible that 2 average parents can give birth to a child that's above average, or that's higher IQ than the parents are? Okay.
No question. So that an expected range, if you had 2 parents that are right on the mean at 100 IQ, their child could reasonably be expected to be all the way down to 87 or all the way up to 113. So it wouldn't be surprising at all. That would be a very fairly normal range of variance that would take place. So what we're finding is I can go ahead and upset some people now. Just why not? That's what we do here. This is horse breeding, people. Okay, this is what you're doing. You're breeding horses, all right? And so you can take a couple of fancy people and breed them. You can take a couple of champions, and it turns out that you get a nag. That's just how it is. Or it turns out you get Secretariat, or it turns out you get something in the middle. but most of the sons and daughters of Secretariat didn't do much. So the whole idea is that once in a while, they get a superstar that generally is not as extraordinary as the parent, but might be very, very good. Okay, but most of the sons and daughters of Secretariat are not too special because they've regressed to the mean. And the reason why that's true, just very briefly to clarify why this would work, it's not some magical process. It's that Secretariat himself was a particularly bizarre configuration coming out of his own gene pool. So if you could think of think of a very heterogeneous chocolate shake, where there's parts of it that are chocolatier and parts of it are the more vanilla and parts of it didn't get any sugar in it, okay? And you stick your straw in there and you suck it up and it turns out, bam, you hit the really good part. It's like you might not have, but you just happen to. So that's Secretariat. So Secretariat is, has a whole slew of genes, and the ones that happen to be that happen to be represented in that particular individual as active, that combination gave rise to a superstar. Now, but he carries with him a whole bunch of other genes, and that when he breeds, those other genes are likely to be the ones that get expressed in the next generation, and they're not as fancy. So he was a superstar of his own particular gene team. So you can think about then this is what I call meet the parents, okay? So you're dating some girl and you think she's pretty hot, and then you kind of, before you get serious, you want to meet the parents. So you meet the parents and you meet the two sisters, and it turns out your girl is the superstar relative to the two sisters, and you're looking at the mom and you're looking at the dad, and you're like, how the heck did you drop out of this group? And now this is going to make you realize, wait a minute, you're an unrepresentative sample of your gene pool, all right? Think about how you feel about it a little bit differently if it turns out that the sisters are just as beautiful and the mom's a goddess and the dad's cool, looks like Cary Grant. It's like, wow, you're an honest representation of your gene pool. See what I'm saying? So this is what the person is that they just happen to be a particular representation of a whole host of genes that they're carrying. And so when you see somebody that's particularly outstanding, good or bad, in other words, far away from the middle of the gene pool, it is far away from the general gene pool, the general population, it's exceedingly likely that they are an outlier with respect to their own gene pool. And so that their offspring are going to be reeling it back towards the middle. That's an almost certainty. Okay, so Shaquille O'Neal is clearly the outlier of his gene pool at 7'2". Now his son is 6'11", but that's a pretty big fall. Okay, so he's already come 3 whole inches, which is a lot in terms of, it doesn't seem much to us. Obviously, the kid's a giant, but his child will probably be 6'7". Okay, so 2 generations out, Shaquille O'Neal's tallest grandchild is likely to be 6'7". So we see that Shaquille himself was an outlier, and we watch the process of the recirculation of extraordinary genes, and that's why the socioeconomic consequences of this in intermediate or long term are far more fluid than has been hypothesized previously.